Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Building Master Detail Apps in App Builder. This has been long awaited. We've been talking about this for months, so we're so excited to be able to deliver today's webinar and show you what we've got cooking. So today's hosts, myself, Jason Beres, and of course George Abraham. George will be doing all of the heavy lifting today in his great demo, so thank you, George, for that. But we are very excited to get this new feature in your hand. It will completely change the way you approach building apps with App Builder. If you haven't gotten serious about how you're enabling endpoints to do data binding, all of that becomes really necessary now, and it really elevates, or this release really elevates what App Builder can deliver in your app building experience. So no longer do you have to kind of do stuff in App Builder, fake a few things, then generate code, then go spend all this time doing additional work in Visual Studio Code. You can do all of the hard data binding stuff right directly in App Builder. And I've been using it in some real apps over the last couple weeks, and it's really saved me a ton of time. It's actually pretty sweet. And a lot of the webinars I did around master detail, this and that, and Angular, Blazor, now it becomes so easy. I don't have to write all that code. So App Builder is really helping out. So today we are going to do a quick overview of App Builder. We'll do a demo. George will do the demo like I mentioned. Of course, the poll as usual. Then we'll wrap this up. Ask questions in the Q&A or in the chat. And as usual, slides and recording will be sent tomorrow. So what is the goal of App Builder? If you are new to App Builder, the goal is really to help you design and build apps blazing fast. We started this product maybe 3-4 years ago with the initial design goal of letting you create screens, and then we are going to generate production-ready code. So the initial must-have feature is it must generate code. Our target market is developers, and you guys need code. You need code that you can open up in Visual Studio Code, and then modify. And then over the last few years, it's significantly improved how much you can actually do with the product. So no longer is it just a simple tool to maybe make some screens. We've added all kinds of layout capability, all kinds of features in the property editors, all of the branding and theming capability, the ability to actually merge pull requests in GitHub without overwriting stuff. And now this year we focused heavily on data. So now our data story is near complete. There's always going to be things that we need to do, but if you think about what you need to do with data, most of it you can get done with App Builder. And what we're trying to do is really bring that Visual Basic 6 fun into building web apps, and we're getting there. I mean, it's pretty darn fun to build stuff because you get satisfaction very quickly. I can do something, very quickly see that it's working and running, and then I can generate that code and then maybe integrate it into my app or do whatever the heck I want. And it just saves so much time. So we've been moving to low code throughout this whole journey, and our goal is to be a top-tier low-code product and then moving into the no-code space. So our goal, yes, continue to add more features that make you write less code. And as I mentioned, this year it was all about data. Data. We started the year, we shipped CRUD, we shipped the ability to bind to nested repeaters. Then we continued to work on that story in the first few months, added some combo box capabilities, more grid features. Then we added column templates in the grid. We added more properties for the grid. So at that point, maybe by middle of the year, the grid was pretty solid in terms of what you could do, along with all of the prior features around data binding and CRUD. And now with this release, adding the ability to do master detail, bind individual fields to fields in an endpoint, do routing, all this stuff, you can do some pretty powerful and rich data applications with App Builder. So if you think about a lot of the apps that IT builds, they're data-bound apps with CRUD. So, okay, we're getting there. Pretty much with this release, you can do almost any type of data-bound app with CRUD. And now what do you have to do as a developer? You generate that code, you ship it over into Visual Studio Code, You generate maybe some more screens or add some authentication, whatever the heck else you got to do, and then you can deploy it out. So we're kind of missing that last piece around authentication, authorization, deployment, and that's what kind of puts us in the no-code space, but we're going to get there eventually. When we look at what 2024 is bringing into App Builder, it's a lot around component customization in the toolbox, more scenarios around types of apps like, yes, I do need authentication and authorization, more data sources. So right now we provide the ability for you to just enable or add Swagger endpoints. But what if you have SQL Server? What if you have Snowflake? Is there an easier way to do it? So we're thinking about these things when it comes to making your life easier with App Builder. So we're really excited about this release. I think you'll be excited too. We're excited about moving forward into 2024 with even more features that will enable you to deliver better apps for your users and your customers. And of course, your feedback is critical, which is why we have the poll, which we ask you to answer at the end of the demo. So with that, I'm going to stop. I am going to let George take over, and he has a great end-to-end demo of exactly what shipped in this latest release. And so with that, George, I will let you take it from here.
Hello, everyone. The big news is that we are introducing support for variables in App Builder. And some of you already know, but variables are essential building blocks for dynamic data-driven apps. It allows you to store and pass data between components on the same view or screen, or even between different views. And as the name suggests, the variable's value can be changed based on a user interaction, for example, a selection change or some other trigger condition. So in my demo, I will show you how you can use variables to create a common application scenario like master detail or selection detail. And as part of this demo, we'll be covering 5 things related to variables. First, we'll talk about how you can create variables in your app. The second, I'll show you how you can update the variable value. The third, how to use variable as part of an API request. The fourth, to bind a component property to a variable. And then finally, I'll show you how you can manage the variables available in your app. So let's get started. So what you're seeing here is one particular view I have created using the support from variables. And what that allows me to do is I have a list shown on the left, which is showing me all the customers, and it's bound to an API GET request. And on the right side, I have sort of like a details pane where I'm showing you some details of a customer and what their orders were. And then we have another pane here for order details. How this app is supposed to work is that when I interact with my list here, you can see that the values on the right side of the pane are being updated based on what I clicked on. So for example, this one is Anton, and you can see that the Anton customers details are now being populated here. And then in the customer orders table, you can see all the orders which have been placed by Anton. And when I click on one of the line items in the grid for customer orders, the order details would actually update. So in this case, there's no orders for this particular customer here. But if I click on something else, as you can see, the order details pane is lighting up. Now, all of this magic is done with the use of variables. So now to show you how I actually built it, I am going to switch to the editor here. And in my editor, I'm going to switch to a screen, which looks very much like the screen I was showing you earlier. But the only difference is that this one is showing you everything which was possible in App Builder before we introduced the support for variables. So in this scenario, what I want to happen is whenever somebody clicks on that list item, I want to be able to update the details pane on the right and show real values for customer ID and company name. And I will also use the same click interaction to power a change to the customer orders so I can show customer orders. So as I mentioned before, this is already bound to an API request. And what I'm going to do now is add a click interaction. So on click interaction, you will see that there's a new action which we have added to the set, and that's called set variable. If I click set variable, it's now showing as blank because guess what? We have no variables defined in this particular application. So we can create a variable on the fly. So I'm going to click new variable. And I want to store the entire object, right? So I want that specific record to be saved based on the click interaction. So I can choose what kind of variable I want to define. And you can see under object type, you will see that all the data sources are already listed. And I know that this is the one I've been using for the GET request, the Northwind API v2. And when you open that up, you will see both the schema and the endpoints which are available from the definition so that I can create an object of that type, customers. So I'm going to do that. And I'm going to name this variable var customer. And I'm going to keep it as a local variable. And if you are not familiar with local versus global, local variables are scoped to this particular view. So it can only be changed or modified by actions or interactions from inside this particular view. But if it's a global variable, that value you have stored will be accessible from other parts of your application. So now I have set it as a local variable. I'm going to hit create. And the value is going to come from the data context of that repeat. So in this case, it's actually revealing that there is an object for /customers. And you can see that I can drill down and it'll show me that these are all the fields. And what I really want is everything. So for that, I'm going to select the entire object. And at this point, anytime somebody clicks on the list item, set variable action is triggered. And I'm able to set a target variable called var customer, which we just created. And it's going to get its value, the object value, from the data context of that particular list. Now that I have stored that value, when I come into customer ID, you would see that I now have this plug icon for customer ID. And the plug icon is just saying connect to data. And let's do that. I'm going to click on customer ID. And when I open that picker, now you would see local variables as var customer is now showing up here. So I can just drill in and pick customer ID. And you see there's a curly braces being added here. Because at this point, I have no real data stored for this thing. It's just that we know that it's expecting customer ID in here. Same thing for company name. I go to var customer, I say company name. And just for the interest of time, I'm not going to do the street, city, and country, but you get the picture. Now, the customer orders is where it gets a little more interesting. For customer orders, currently it's bound to this mock data source, right? But I want an actual API which provides me those parameters, which allows me to get all the orders for a particular customer. So if I open up my data now and I go to the API I have configured, you can see that this particular API has all the endpoints I would expect to function this particular kind of application. So I am looking for customer orders. So I can say customer ID orders. So I'm going to select this one. And at this point, you will see that it's trying to fetch data, but it cannot do it because it has some required stuff missing. So I'm going to do that with the use of variables. So here you can see that the endpoint is expecting an ID parameter, which is required. And I'm going to use variables. I open it up. And under var customer, you will see that it only allows me to drill down. It expects me to pick something meaningful here. And I'm going to use customer ID as the ID for this particular request. So I'm going to set customer ID. I hit done. At this point, that grid is configured. Now let's see this in action, seeing if everything works as we expected. I hit play. And now if when I click on my list here, you can see that we have correctly done the binding for the details area here. So whatever I clicked on is being populated. And the customer orders is also making a request for Anton based on what I just clicked. So same thing for Bergs, for Blar, and it works perfectly. Now let's go back here. And now I showed you an example where I was using a click interaction. But some of these components we have also have a native selection kind of an event. And that's what we're going to use in order to pull in order details, right? So in order to do order details, what I want from the grid is I want to add row selection as a feature. So I added row selection and single row selection is added. And let's just enhance it by saying, okay, show checkbox is good. And I'm going to add an interaction. And you can see that there's a row selection changed event now available on the grid, in addition to the row added, row edited, and row deleted, which are part of the CRUD features. But for now, we need row selection changed. And then it's pretty much the exact same format. But the difference is that the value is already pre-picked because we know it's a grid and it's going to give us the object out of the box for the selected row. All I need is something to set as a variable. But before we do that, let's just bind that second grid, which is supposed to show order details, to an endpoint which actually gives us order details. So get rid of this mock data source I have, go back to the API I have added. And in this API, I'm looking for any kind of endpoints which actually provide me order details. So I'm just going to look for orders. And I have one here called order ID details. And I think this is the one I want, so I'm going to select it. And at this point, it's again requiring a parameter, just like the previous grid. But I open it up. It's saying, hey, I need an ID to be passed into it to make a request. And I don't have that ID. And it looks like it's a numeric type of ID. So the difference we're going to do now is going back to the first grid. We're going to add the selection event on that grid row in order to give us what we need as a variable. So as I mentioned before, it is providing a variable which is not var customer is not what I want. I want a new variable. But this time, since I only need the ID, unlike the last time where I was creating an object, so because I had to kind of populate the details area here, this time I only need the ID. So instead of creating a variable based on the entire object, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a simple variable based like a numeric variable, and I call it var order ID. I'm going to leave it as a local variable. I'm going to create it. And now that the variable is created, you can see that it's showing that there's a mismatch between the target variable type and the source value, because the source value was automatically picked up by the interactions to show that, hey, it's a grid, it's a selection event, we're going to give you a selected row. But I can, of course, change that. So instead of going and getting the selected row by default, I can dive in and just get order ID, because that's the field which will link these two tables together. So I selected order ID. So now you can see that this grid is set up slightly differently than the previous one, where I was actually setting on the list item, I was setting var customer as a target variable, which is an object, and I was also storing the object value. But in the case of the second grid, I only need the bare minimum, which is the var order ID, which I just created, and order ID. Now that I have created var order ID, I can always go back to the second grid and do the exact same thing I did for the first one. I'm going to bind this to var order ID. And that's it. At this point, my interactions are set up. So the first grid actually has a selection event, which is going to set my var order ID. And my order details is pointing to an endpoint, which is expecting a parameter. The parameter is now mapped to var order ID. And if I run it, everything should work exactly as I expected. So I click on this, I click on my row here, and I can see that the order details is now being updated based on whatever values I have in that particular grid. So based on what I just showed you, we pretty much covered 4 out of the 5 things I wanted to explain to you. First, I showed you how you can create variables on the fly. You can set the data type for that particular variable, set it as global or local. We also showed you how you can update the variable's value based on an event, and I was using the set variable action. We actually ended up using the variable as part of an API request in order to populate the first grid and the second grid, which is what I showed just now. And then we talked about binding a component's property to a variable, which is what we ended up doing here, which is the customer ID is bound to a value coming from the variable. Now, the final thing I want to show you is how do you manage variables in your app? Because we have been creating these variables, they show up at the right time in the right pickers, but where do all these variables live? Well, guess what? It lives at the view level because we've defined these variables as a local variable. You can see in the property pane for the view itself, you have 2 variables now called var customer and var order ID. And to edit this variable after the fact, I can always come in here and click on the variable chip to show me the edit variable dialog. Now, oftentimes I would like to show design time data, not these placeholders for the variables. And there is a way for you to do that, because if you look at the order ID, which is a simple numeric type variable, there is a way in which you can provide an initial value. However, for an object type, it is just too tedious to actually type in what the default value would be. So for that, we have this option to initialize this variable from an API request. So if I turn that on, you can see that I can now select customer orders, which is a different endpoint, or I can go back and select customer ID, which will give me the object I require. So I can set that as the endpoint. And naturally, it's expecting a parameter, and it wants an ID. And here, I can provide the initial value for the ID manually, right? So I can type in a customer ID like Anatar and hit send. And you'll see that now I've got data for that particular variable with this default value of Anatar. I hit done. And if I hit save, you will see that now the customer ID has been replaced by the data I just received. The same thing happened for the customer orders table, because this one was also linked to the same variable called customer, the var customer, because of which, since the var customer got hydrated with some initial data, the grid also got that same information. Same thing I can do with the numeric variable. So if I go to var order ID, and if I type in one of the order numbers, for what I can think of, it would be like 10308. And if I hit save, now you'll see that the second grid has been populated with data for the default value. And finally, you can of course create brand new variables without doing it on the fly by just coming to the variables section here, hitting the plus sign, and then create your own local variable or global variable. So in summary, I showed you how you can actually set variables on the fly, create them from the variable picker, click new variable, and be able to create it. I showed you how you can actually set the value based on the data context for that particular list. I showed you how you can bind the component properties to the variable values which we have actually saved. I showed what you can do with an endpoint which is now expecting a parameter, and how you can use a variable to provide it dynamic values. And finally, I showed you how you can get design time data for especially variables of the type object by initializing that variable from an API request. And that's it for variables in App Builder and how it can be used to create dynamic data-driven apps. We are always looking forward to your feedback on how it's working for you, and see you next time for another feature-packed demo.
Okay, George, thank you so much for that demo. I love it. And that was a beautiful application as well. So I really appreciate that demo, and I hope everyone online got the idea that really your experience now in App Builder is completely elevated with data. So no longer are you generating code, adding all this extra stuff in Visual Studio Code, seeing if it works, all that stuff. It's just kind of all automatic now, and we're really excited to get this into your hands. Also, if I bring up the blog, we posted this blog last week. Zdravko did a great job. Please go to this blog. Maybe Jesse or JJ can paste this into the chat, and you will be able to read at length about everything that George talked about in the demo. This is a very long blog. It has a lot of screenshots and a lot of detail on what this feature includes, and it's a great learning tool. It's like a masterclass blog on how to use every feature in this release. So please take a look at this blog. Zdravko, thank you very much for posting such a great blog. And let's go back. Please continue to answer the poll. We're going to keep answering questions in the chat. But your next steps, get App Builder today. So go to infragistics.com/products/App Builder and start your free trial if you haven't. If you already own the product, then go ahead and try out this new feature and give us feedback. As you know, we are on Discord. So if you don't have the Discord link to sign up and register, I think that's in the chat as well. But that's where the product team hangs out, and a lot of customers are on Discord now. So there's a bigger and bigger community growing every day on Discord. And of course, we have playlists up on YouTube with all kinds of good stuff. But our goal here, as we've said many, many times, is to help you build apps faster than before. We want to remove all of the mundane error-prone code that you have to worry about writing all the time, and let a tool help you do it so then you can focus on what's important. So I want to thank you again. I want to thank George for a great demo. We will stay online and answer questions for a few more minutes or until whenever they're done. Stay tuned for another App Builder release in about a month from now, end of November, early December, with some more features. And we're going to continue to roll out probably monthly releases as we have all year with more features. But with that, I want to thank everyone again. I know you have a lot of choices for your time, and we will see you at the next webinar.